Hi everyone, it's Michaela again, here for your next session of your business administration course. So for today's session we are going to be looking at communication in business admin. So your aims and objectives of this session are to compare communication methods and know when to use them, to know how to overcome barriers to communication, to identify positive and negative spoken language, and to understand tone of voice, body language, speaking clearly, and how these can impact communication. So we're going to start by having a look at some communication methods. So this here relates to question 1. So the first communication method you've got there is email. So lots of you have been emailing me work and emailing me confirmations and things, so I know that you understand about email. Letters, so we've got letters there, there's a bit of an example there, it's very small. Letters we usually receive sort of more formally from perhaps, well, certainly in my post it's mostly bills. Sort of more formally written letters, it might be from, say, like a college or something like that. A telephone call. So telephone calls, well, a lot of people don't have landlines anymore, do they? So a house phone anymore. I certainly don't have a house phone anymore, but I do still receive calls on my mobile. I know some people prefer to text, but we still can speak to each other over the phone. Generally, again, it can be quite formal. It could be like your job centre that's ringing you. Face-to-face communication, so the example in the picture there, you can see there's a bit of a sort of interview going on. That's one example of when you've had face-to-face communication. It could be that you are in a shop, you are communicating in a shop face-to-face. You could be, what else could you be doing? Seeing your GP, although at the minute those are over things like Skype and Zoom. And the last one there is text message. So text messages are used obviously personally, but quite often in business as well. We use text messages quite a lot to communicate with learners on our programs. We find it's a really useful tool for quick and easy messaging to yourselves there. So why do we use these? So emails are good for sending information instantly to either one person or a group of people. You can send lots of information at once, you can send attachments, and you can often see if the emails have been read as well if you've got a specialist software. There's one called Mail Tracker. A lot of work emails have that function built in as well. A letter, it's a bit of a snail pace, isn't it? It's a much slower method of communication, it's formal, but you can still send lots of information at once, but we don't know if it's been received, we don't know if it's got lost in the mail, or perhaps it's been received but it's not been open, or it's just not been read. Maybe it's just been put on the side and left and forgotten about. A telephone call, so again an instant method of communication, but only if the person answers their phone. It can be quite difficult sometimes for communication because we cannot read each other's body language. So although you can use different tones of voice, you can't see a person's reaction to the information that you're sharing. Face-to-face, so, well, usually it would be an everyday method of communication where we can see people, but at the minute that's quite a rarity in this current climate. Although you can still go to the shop, so you can still see people in that capacity. You're able to read each other's body language, and if they're able to understand what you're saying, perhaps they'll be nodding and smiling in agreement. The last one here is text message. So text message is an everyday method of communication. Again, I certainly use texts. Well, I don't even know how many texts I send a day. Perhaps there's a setting in my phone where I can find that out. I tried to think. We can send short messages. You can also send quite long messages now as well. It can be quite informal. We don't necessarily know if people have read it or understood it. With a typical text message, if you're using an iPhone with iMessage on, you've got those red reports on there if they're using a iPhone as well. WhatsApp is, another type of text message there where you can see if the person has read it because of those blue ticks and their online status. But those can also be changed in the settings, so you don't have to show that all the time either. So there's pros and cons to all of these methods of communication, as you can see. So you're going to work through a scenario for question 1. So your scenario is you have been asked to communicate a staff fun day at a rock climbing centre. Your role is to ensure all the staff members have responded to state whether they want to come or not. You need to contact the rock climbing centre to book the event. So what are we going to do? So when you're working through the scenario, you have to describe 3 different methods of communication and show why this is a good method to use for the task that you've got. So these methods cannot be repeated. You can only use each method once. If you use the same method twice, you're going to have to go back over this work and do it again. So please make sure that you are only using each method once. Please make sure that you have at least one method of verbal communication and at least one method of written communication. So there's 3 parts to this question, so you could have 2 where you use your voice, such as phone or face-to-face or Skype, and 1 where you write, such as an email, a letter or a text. You could have 2 that are written instead and just 1 that is verbal. As long as there's at least 1 of each, that's what matters. And don't repeat yourself. So you're going to have a look through each of the sort of mini scenarios in just a moment. So that's on the next slide here. So you're going to be giving out details of the event and how to secure or decline a place. So what is the best method of communicating this and why? So in your answer, you need to tell me what the method is that you've chosen and give me a reason. My biggest tip here is don't fill this in yet. Wait till you've read the other 2 before you decide on your final choices. The next part, you have only been contacted by 5 out of 20 people regarding the event and the deadline is in 2 days' time. Your managers need you to figure out the exact numbers. What is the best method of communicating this and why? So again, use a different method to what you used in part 1. Do not repeat the same method and give me a reason as to why this is going to be a good method. Your last part here, you've now received 17 people's confirmation that they want to come to the rock climbing centre and you need to book the event. So how are you going to contact the rock climbing centre? How are you going to book this event? So what is the best method of communicating with the rock climbing centre and why? So your method here should be different to the 2 that you've already used, and you need to ensure that you have used at least 1 written method and at least 1 verbal method. So if you've done 2 written ones so far or 2 verbal ones so far, you need to now mix it up. Barriers to communication. So we're working towards question 2 now. So some people may have barriers to communication. It could be that they don't use English very well. It could be that their English is a second language or an additional language to them, and their language acquisition may be okay, but we need to sort of understand, is it going to be a barrier or not for them? Somebody may be deaf, they may be blind. You do get people as well who are non-verbal. Some people will have a learning disability, so this could be something like autism or Down syndrome. And the last barrier to communication here is a misunderstanding or a lack of clarity or knowledge. So not really grasping what you're saying but agreeing anyway. because that's going to be a barrier. If you're giving out some information and you're expecting somebody to do something with that information and they don't do it, it may be that they misunderstood what you meant in the first place. So we've got to be clear, got to give clarity. So overcoming the barriers. So how do we solve these barriers? What can we do to help people who have barriers to communication? So we need to amend the way that we communicate with people. We need to change the way we communicate. But to do that, we need to understand the barrier that they have. So we need to have knowledge about what the barrier is rather than just knowing the word of it. So yes, somebody may be registered blind, but that can affect people individually. You can be registered blind but still have sight. You can be registered blind and have no sight. So we need to make reasonable adjustments to help people to understand and communicate back with us. Now that phrase there, reasonable adjustments, we used that yesterday in your session on laws. You need to be flexible in your approach. So just because one thing works for one person, it doesn't mean it will work for everybody. So we're going to have a look at some scenario examples together now, just to enhance your learning. A new staff member who has a hearing impairment has recently joined the office which you work at. What could you do to try and make communication easier for her? So I've put some ideas here for you, so you need to find out what works for her to make communication easier. First and foremost, ask questions. Find out what works. It may be beneficial to get her attention before speaking to her. Speak face to face so she can see you. She may lip read. Use body language to show that you're listening. Speak louder if needed, but don't shout. You have recently started working with a new customer who suffers with anxiety and often has panic attacks and gets emotionally distressed. When this happens, the customer has difficulty communicating. What could you do to make communication easier for the customer? So here, when somebody's having an anxiety or panic attack and they're getting quite emotionally distressed, we need to not overwhelm somebody with too much information. Instead, what we need to do is make sure the customer knows that you are listening, that you are there if they need to say something. If they're having trouble speaking to you, perhaps, imagine this is a face-to-face time. They need to know that you are there. I'm here, just take a breath. You need to speak calmly. You need to use shorter sentences so they're easier to understand. Now the reason I've said that is because you don't want to overwhelm somebody with a very long sentence with very complex words when they're having sort of an anxiety or panic attack. It's not going to help them. You need to use short sentences and quite an easy vocabulary, easy words, so that you're easier to understand. They might not be able to respond straight away. So quite often when people have panic attacks, or anxiety attacks, they might need some time to respond because their heart might be racing in their chest and it might be very difficult to get words out. So if you are face to face, offer them a seat, maybe offer them some water and just say, just take a break, take a breather, I'll give you 5 minutes and I'll come back. Over the phone, you could say that you'll wait for them to respond. Just tell them not to worry. These things are quite common, unfortunately, for many people, and it can be difficult because not many people understand how to deal with it, which is why it's an important part for you to sort of understand that people will have difficulties perhaps when you're on the phone or perhaps when you are face to face. What we don't want to do is to overwhelm somebody with lots of information or tell them to calm down. When working in administration, you'll be working with people from different cultures and backgrounds. If you work with a customer who has English as a second language, What could you do to communicate more effectively with them? So we kind of looked at this one a little bit earlier in terms of, just because somebody uses English as a second language, it doesn't mean that they don't understand English. It may be that they're fluent in English. So we need to find out what their level of English is. Can they communicate in English quite well? What works for the customer? So again, we're treating them as an individual. If they are having difficulty understanding you, you could use simple words and shorter sentences. Perhaps there's a staff member in your office who uses the same language. You could ask them for help with translation. You could try and use something like Google Translate, but sometimes it can be quite unreliable. It doesn't work very well for all languages, unfortunately. Some of you who use English as a second language will agree that Google Translate doesn't often work when translating sort of full sentences, but it might work okay for the keywords. You can use your body language to help you to communicate too. So you could point to objects, so things like window or door, or perhaps where to sign in. So you're working in a hospital outpatients department as an administrator and have a patient who's suffered a stroke. They're having some difficulty speaking and sounding out certain words. What could you do to make communication run more smoothly? So some of you may be less familiar with somebody who's perhaps had a stroke. So a stroke will affect somebody mainly down one side of their body, depending on which side of their brain has been damaged by the stroke. So it can cause their mouth to be sort of more relaxed on one side. Also their tongue will be more relaxed on one side. So it can be quite difficult for them to make the right sounds for the words. So most importantly, give the person time to respond. Give them time to respond to you, because it might just take a little bit more effort for them to get those words out, because those muscles in their mouth and their tongue have been compromised. You can ask them simple questions that require a shorter response. So perhaps trying to use closed questions rather than open questions. Questions that lead to a yes or no answer, just to make it that bit easier. You could see if they can write things down, because if the stroke has affected them on their left side and they're right-handed, then their right hand should be okay to write with. If you are still having difficulty, you could maybe try a quieter area to try and communicate, if there's one available. Now, like I said before, we can't treat every person the same. This isn't an absolute top-notch how-to guide on how to speak to somebody who has had a stroke or who uses English as a second language. This is just ideas of ways that you could try, because like I said before, you need to be flexible in your approach. You are speaking to one of your colleagues in the staff room about some changes to the work process. There is some building work going on outside the window, and the colleague is struggling to hear what you're saying. What could you do to improve communication? So just imagine here there's lots of banging going on, and it's very difficult to hear above that loud noise. Perhaps the window's open, you need to close it. You could go to a quieter area of the building to have a meeting. You could postpone the meeting to a more convenient time. You could also try and communicate this via email if it's appropriate. That depends on the content of the meeting. But what we're not going to do is tell them builders to stop working, because if they're working outside the window, it probably needs doing. You are working with a customer who is blind. When speaking with each other, what could you do to make communication easier? So in terms of speaking to a customer who is blind, you need to ensure that you get their attention before you start speaking to them, because they can't see you. They may not know that you're there. You don't want to startle somebody. You can then just speak as normal, because the person will be able to hear you. So you've got some different scenarios in your work booklet. So what I would like you to do is explain 3 methods of communicating with customers using the given scenarios for question 2. Again, you need to give one example as written and one example as verbal, and you need to use sentences in your answer. And because you are explaining, you need to tell me why this, or how or why this will affect communication. How will it help the person? So your scenarios here are different to the ones that I've looked at, so I'd like you to think about the answers before starting. So your scenarios here, you've got a female customer who enters the reception area of the business and takes a seat. It's company policy that she must sign in. When you ask her to come over, and if you can help, she ignores you. You notice that she's got hearing aids in her ears. So what can you do to ensure that she is able to communicate effectively with you? A male customer has called to make a complaint about poor service. He is shouting down the phone and is repeatedly asking to speak to your manager. Your manager is out of the office, but you cannot state this as the man will not allow you to speak. What will you do? A young lady comes to the office reception area and speaks in another language. You reply in English and ask if she understands, and she continues to speak in her own language. What will you do? So the two that are in white on your screen, I've kind of given you tips towards that. So if you are struggling with the middle one, because you're getting a complaint about poor service and he's shouting at you and repeatedly asking, can you speak to your manager? You can't really interrupt him whilst he's doing that, because if you interrupt him, all you're going to do is add fuel to the fire and make him more angry. Instead, what you're going to have to do is show empathy. You are going to have to let him say his part first, so you're going to have patience. So, you know, think about what method of communication you're going to be using there. You're on the phone. Okay. So pause this video now whilst you complete that question. For your next question here, it's on positive and negative language. Okay. So when we're thinking about language, it is literally the spoken words. So, hello, in comparison to, what do you want? Hi, how can I help you today? In comparison to, I'm busy. So let's think of some other examples. So some other examples of positive could be, hello, how can I help you today? Have a great day. In comparison to some negative examples that could be, that's not my job. Go away. I'm too busy to help you right now. Unfortunately, I'm sure we've all had some of those negative ones in our lives. So what I would like you to do for this one is you need to write the actual verbal phrases. You don't need to explain them, just give me the actual verbal phrases. You can't use body language as an example, it has to be what you physically say using your voice. So I need 2 examples of positive and 2 examples of negatives. Please try and use different ones to ones I've already used today. Next, you have some videos to watch on speaking clearly, so you can have a click of that. If you're watching this on YouTube, you'll need to go into the PowerPoint to get this. I could also link it in the description bar below. So speaking clearly is a positive tone of voice. It's using the correct volume, the correct use of language, so not swearing. Not using jargon or abbreviations. If you're not sure what jargon is, it's sort of like language that you use perhaps in a certain environment. So we sometimes call you our pets, pre-employability trainees. It doesn't mean that I would call you a pet to your face. An abbreviation, so for example, your funding comes from AEB. That doesn't really make much sense to you. It comes from the adult education budget. So we need to speak clearly and avoid using those things with people that don't understand them, otherwise we're essentially just talking in riddles. By speaking clearly, it helps customers to understand what you're saying. It's going to stop customers from feeling that they need to complain, because hopefully nothing's going to be misinterpreted. And it's going to help to communicate accurate information. So you need to describe how staff can communicate with customers using different behaviours and features. So firstly, I would like you to look at the box regarding speaking clearly, and then you'll move on to tone of voice. So tone of voice, again, you've got a video here that you can have a look at. Again, I'll put it in the description bar below, and it's also available in your PowerPoint. So tone of voice. Tone of voice is using a varied pitch, so not using a monotone pitch. The volume is soft, you're not speaking too fast, but you're also not speaking too slow. A negative tone of voice is a monotone pitch. It's low volume. You might speak too slow, or you might speak too fast. By adjusting your tone of voice, it shows that you're not bored. It shows that you're interested in what you are saying. It lets people know that you're worth listening to, because you are giving some variation in your pitch. If you think about how newsreaders read the news, they go up and down and up and down. People also feel that you're more trustworthy if you've got a positive tone. So more sales, more job security. So again, same question, just the next box down there. So how staff can communicate with customers using their different behaviours and features for question 4. And this time we're looking at tone of voice. And you're going to describe the different tones and describe why it's important when talking to customers. Make sure you're using sentences there. Another video here for positive and negative body language. I would like you to try and have a look at that. Again, I'll leave the link in the description bar down below. So positive body language, what is it? It is making eye contact with people. I know some people sometimes find that a bit tricky, especially with things like anxiety. People on the autistic spectrum also find that quite tricky. But eye contact is a positive body language. So if you are struggling with eye contact, what you can do instead is look at the space between someone's eyebrows. Nodding and smiling as you're speaking or as you're listening allows the person to understand that you are grasping what they're saying, so you're interpreting it well. Having your shoulders back, so you're in a relaxed posture. You might lean in ever so slightly so you can listen a little bit closer. So they're all positive behaviours in your body language. Whereas negative body language could be biting nails, because you're covering your mouth as well, that's a negative. Folding your arms, so think about an interview sort of setup. You don't want to be sat there folding your arms and looking like you're not really bothered about being there. Tapping your body parts, so if you sat there tapping your legs, you're concentrating so much on that you're probably not really listening. Leaning your hand on your cheek, so again it looks like you've probably not had enough sleep. Checking the time, it kind of shows that you're otherwise occupied, maybe you've got somewhere better to be. It's considered quite rude to check the time. If you're looking at the floor, if you're not making that eye contact, it looks like you're not listening. So in terms of positive body language, all of those behaviours show that you're listening, shows that you're confident and that you're relaxed in your position. Whereas negative body language, it shows what you're thinking. If you've got a sad face, you're going to look pretty unhappy. You're going to look not bothered if you sat there folding your arms. Whereas if you are smiling, you appear happy to be listening and to be there. So you're going to do this question again in 2 parts. So how staff communicate with customers using different behaviours and features, and this time we're looking at positive and negative body language. So your first part here is positive body language, so you're going to describe what that is using sentences, and then what would customers think about that type of body language. So hopefully you'll say it's a good thing. And then the next one is negative body language. How would customers feel with that one, and what it is again. Okay, so that's your aims and objectives back here. So that is the end of your session. So you should have covered communication methods and understand when to use them. You should know how to overcome barriers to communication. Negative and positive spoken language examples. So we looked at those as well. And you should now have a better understanding of tone of voice, body language and speaking clearly, and how these can impact communication. Okay, thank you for watching this video. You can like and subscribe, give us a thumbs up.